Welcome to Garden Inspire. I'm Buna. Today we're going to talk about wild edible plants. So it's a good thing to know what there is to eat in the wild in case you were stranded or some other situation happened. Also, it's good to know what you might be able to find in your own yard to eat. And I can almost guarantee you that some of these things you will find in your yard. And we're going to be talking about plants that are pretty widespread. So you should be able to find some of these things in your area. So there's some good things to be aware of. The first one is identification. There's a lot of stories going around about this is how you choose what to eat and what not to eat, and a lot of those have inaccurate information. So to be safe, the most important thing is to know that you're identifying the plant correctly. If you're not, it could possibly kill you or just make things extremely unpleasant. So another thing is, don't assume that if a plant is eaten by wildlife that you can eat it, because what they can eat is not the same, and sometimes they make mistakes. Know cautions for each plant, like are there certain plants that you need to be aware of due to your medical conditions you should avoid, or should you only eat it cooked, those kinds of things. Avoid collecting in areas that could be contaminated with either the water supply or due to car exhaust. Sometimes around pathways and roadways, they spray with pesticides and things, so it's good to avoid that. And then while you're harvesting, make sure you're aware of your surroundings, of other animals and things like that that may be in the area. And begin now so that you're familiar with the plants, so you're familiar with how they're used, how they taste, identification. Sometimes people assume that because it's a wild edible plant, it tastes terrible. And some of them I would only use in a survival situation, and other ones taste really good, and quite a few of them I use regularly. So wild plants sometimes taste stronger than what you're used to, so that's another reason to start using them now, so you're a little bit more familiar with that. And leave no trace if possible. So don't harvest everything in the area, just harvest little bits here and there, unless you're starving. If it's a survival situation and you need to eat stuff to save your life, you can just ignore that. Same thing with asking permission if it's private property and obeying laws of national and state forests and parks and other laws. You want to be aware of what those are as far as what you can collect, what's okay. But again, if you're starving, you just eat whatever as long as you've properly identified it, you're using it properly, because we want you to be safe. And edible doesn't necessarily mean tasty. So like I said, some of them are, some of them not so much. And so just get familiar with them, get familiar with how to use them. So I'm going to start with plants to avoid. Now this certainly isn't a list of every plant, but I'm going to talk about some that again are widespread, so you want to know what is dangerous in your area, so you're making sure to avoid those things. So again, incorrect identification could be deadly. So one of the first ones I want to talk about is poison hemlock. So there's several plants in the parsley family that are deadly. Then there's others that are wonderful, like parsley, carrots, those things. If you see leaves that look like parsley, carrot, dill, don't even touch it unless you know for sure proper ID. So poison hemlock, there's no known antidote. It's the plant that killed Socrates. And if you notice here, you can see some purple spots or stripes on the stem. So poison hemlock often has purple stripes or spots. You may not see it, maybe it's a younger plant or something, but if you see that, that's a clue. Definitely don't touch it. I've seen things that suggest picking up and smelling it. I just wouldn't even touch it if you think that, again, it looks like parsley, carrots, anything like that. This is the flower of poison hemlock. And later I'm going to be talking about yarrow, because sometimes people get them mixed up. So I'm going to show them side by side. But the flower, again, looks a lot like dill or parsley. All of them I've seen have white flowers. That doesn't mean all the ones with other flowers like yellow are okay, because they could be another member of the parsley family that's very dangerous. This is myrtle spurge, and this was originally planted as an ornamental plant. And in Utah where I am, it's escaped and it's out in the wild. You can be hiking or something and see it. Anywhere you see it, whether it's Utah or somewhere else, be very careful, because if you get the sap on your skin, it can burn your skin. If you get the sap in your eyes, it can blind you. It is good to remove this if you see it in the wild anywhere, but you want to wear gloves and eye protection. And this is spurge. It's a different kind of spurge. And it's the one over here. There's a little bit of purslane right there because sometimes people get them mixed up. So this spurge grows really, really flat and has tiny white flowers. And if you break it, it has white sap. People will see it in their lawns, flower beds, gardens, things like that. It is not an edible plant. This is poison ivy. And leaves of 3, we've all heard that. And there's other things with 3 leaves that are fine. And then this is poison ivy in the fall when it started to turn red. And then on the right side are the berries of poison ivy, little white berries. Now, most of the time when I've seen poison ivy, I haven't seen any berries. And I think most of us know that this is not something we want to mess with. It's quite unpleasant to have a reaction to that. This is bittersweet nightshade, and there's other nightshades. Deadly nightshade has black fruit instead. It has a beautiful, the bittersweet nightshade has a beautiful purple flower. It's related to tomatoes, so the flower looks a little bit like that. And it's a viney kind of plant. It's often spread by birds. And on the right side are the berries of bittersweet nightshade, and they're red. And it's usually pretty easy to pull it up unless it's been there a while. It's kind of woody, and then you might need to cut it. But again, wear gloves, throw it away. So now I'm going to talk about edible and medicinal plants, and these are ones you can find pretty much all over the US, most of them. So this one is elderberry, and there's different kinds of elderberries. And elderberries are a small shrub or small tree, and they have a bunch of white or sometimes a pale pink flower, and the flowers are edible. Sometimes people will batter them and fry them to eat them. You don't want to eat the leaves and the stems and things, but the stems, the woody ones, if you boil them to get the pith out of the middle, you can use them for whistles. Or you can use them if you're tapping trees for syrup. They've been used for that in the past. But mostly people concentrate on the flowers and the berries. And there's red-berried elderberries, black, that's actually a really dark purple, and this blue. And you don't want to eat the fruit of the red, but the blue and the black fruited ones are just fine. And you want to make sure the fruit is fully ripe, so you can see green ones in this picture and then some kind of just barely getting ripe. But all these blue with the kind of white on it, those are fully ripe. So you harvest those and you want to cook them. Eating raw berries is not recommended. Some people said they've been just fine. But if you eat very many, they tend to come out one way or the other, and that's not a pleasant situation. So cook them, strain off the seed, and then they make great syrups and juices and things like that. And elderberry has been shown to be an antiviral. This is chokecherry, and you're probably used to the cherry tree growing in your yard that has 1 or 2 flowers together. This has a panicle of flowers. And the bark looks a lot like a cherry tree. This is the fruit. So there's only one left on here, whether birds got the other fruit or whatever, I'm not sure. But you want the fruit to be almost black when you harvest it. And then you want to sweeten it. It's called chokecherry for a reason. So syrups, juices, those kinds of things, jams. And so harvest it when it's fully ripe, when it's almost black. You don't want to use the pit at all, just the fruit. And then on the right, that black that you see is a fungus that chokecherry get. And I compare it to if you've put a bunch of marshmallows on a stick and you cook it so long that the marshmallows turn black and start to fall off. That's kind of what it looks like to me. So if you go out and you see what you think is a chokecherry, the bark looks like a cherry, the leaf shape looks like a cherry. Everything else makes it look like chokecherry, and you see that fungus, that is the last identifier to help you know. So when you're identifying plants, it's good to have different things to be sure. If you just go by the leaves, it may not be accurate. But if you can see the leaves and the flowers, or the leaves and the fruit, those kinds of things give you more things to help verify, yes, this is the correct plant that I want. And notice things about the leaf of the shape of the leaf. Is it smooth? Is it serrated? Those kinds of things also help with identification. And after a while, you'll be where you can recognize plants. Just start with a few, one or two, get familiar with those and add some more to it. So this fungus does not affect the fruit at all or edibility. It just helps you identify it. So you can use the inner bark of the cherry for medicinal purposes. The inner bark means if you were to peel off the bark, and then that inside part is the inner bark of the tree. And several trees have an edible inner bark. In the chokecherry case, it's for medicinal purposes. This is a serviceberry. It's also called sarviceberry or juneberry. It's again a small tree or shrub. It has beautiful white flowers in the spring. This leaf shape that's kind of oval and serrated more towards the edge of it. It's in the apple family. The fruit is about the size of a blueberry, and it varies depending on variety, but the fruit starts out kind of pink, turns purple, and then turns a dark blue color. And you can eat it raw, you can cook it in things, you can make a pie out of it. Birds tend to get it. It's a great thing to plant in your landscape, but at first the birds may harvest more of the fruit than you get, but over time you'll get some. But if you see it out in the wild and it's fully ripe, you can go ahead and just eat it raw. This is Oregon grape, and it has bright yellow blooms in the spring. And then later it gets these bluish purple fruit, and they're like a small blueberry size. The leaf looks a lot like a holly leaf, where it's that pokey kind of shape. It is not a holly, it's not related to holly. The fruit is edible, just raw. I didn't find the fruit really tasty raw. Some people like it raw, but you can also make it into jams and juice. And the root of Oregon grape is used as a replacement for golden seal. So if you live somewhere where there isn't golden seal, there's also concerns about golden seal being over-harvested. So you can use the root of an Oregon grape. And Oregon grapes can be kind of a ground cover kind of plant, or they can be a shrub that's several feet tall. And it tends to grow in shady areas. This is a currant. Most currants have flowers that look like the ones in the middle that are kind of a pale greenish yellow color. There are some that have other colors of flowers. On the left here is a golden currant, and it's called that because the flowers are yellow. And the fruit of a currant is usually red, black, or white, but I've seen an orange currant that had the best tasting fruit I've ever had. So currants can be thorny, they may not be thorny. They're usually anywhere between 3 and 5 feet tall. The leaves look like small kind of oak-shaped, or not oak, maple-shaped leaves. And the fruit can be eaten fresh. Some of it doesn't taste very good fresh and it's better in juice or jam, and some of it's delicious fresh. And it's one of the first fruits that I've found that's ripe. This is a rose hip, or the fruit of a rose. So roses are edible, whether they're in your landscape, whether they're in the wild. If you're eating from a landscape or somewhere where somebody could have applied any pesticide, you don't want to use those. But otherwise, you can eat the flower and the fruit of the rose. So if you harvest all the flowers, you're not going to have any fruit. But depending what time of year it is, you might just find whichever one you needed. So rose hips are kind of seedy inside. So sometimes people open them up and take the hairy and seedy stuff out of the middle and then eat them. But you can eat them just as they are, just raw if you want to. They're best harvested after the first frost. And they can be anywhere from this orangey red color to a dark burgundy color. They can be anywhere from a small oval kind of shape to about the size of a quarter. I've seen all those different sizes. And a lot of times people will make them into juices, dry them for later, freeze them for later, make them into jams. It's very high in vitamin C, so it's a great source for that out in the wild. This is burdock. If you ever go to an Asian market and you see something called gobo, it's the same thing. It's the root of this plant. So a lot of times I see it in a shady area, but it doesn't have to be. It can be in the sun. And the leaves are very large. They look a little bit like rhubarb in a way, but they're rougher. And you can eat the leaves, but you want to make sure it's not rhubarb if you're going to do that, because rhubarb leaves are toxic. And the leaves of burdock aren't great either as far as taste, but they're fine to eat. They're kind of pebbly and rough, but the thing that most people eat is the root. So the first year, burdock will look like the one on the right. The second year, it gets this flower stalk, which the picture on the left is starting to get. Then it gets a purple flower, and then it gets burrs. And they're about the size of a dime or a quarter, something like that. And if you're walking your dog, you might get them in your dog's fur. If you're walking, you might get them in your socks. It sticks to that. That's why it's called a burdock. But the root is the main thing that is eaten. So even though you can eat most parts of it, if you harvest the root, that's what people usually eat. And it's often roasted. This is cattails. And because it's growing in water, you want to be really careful of the water source, that there's not pollutants. Be careful of giardia, stuff like that. So cattails have many parts that are edible. The shoots you can eat. The thing on, this is the flower on here, and you can take the pollen off of that and use it like a flower when it's, or like flour, and when it's younger, you can use it like you would corn on the cob. Also, the leaves can be woven into mats or baskets or anything like that. Now, if you see a plant out in the wild like this, make sure for identification that you see this brown hot dog looking thing on here, because otherwise it may not be cattails and you wouldn't want to be eating it. And this is milkweed. So this one is showy milkweed. And with milkweed, many parts of it are edible. The flowers are edible. The pods, these are brown. You would want to eat them when they're green. And then you can steam them, you can fry them, stir fry them. When they get like this, then the seeds are starting to develop and you wouldn't want to eat them at that point. But when they open up and those seeds are in there, you could stuff a pillow with those. You could use them for fire starter if you wanted to. They were actually exploring using those as stuffing for life preservers at one point. So this is plantain, and plantain grows fairly low to the ground, but when it flowers it can get to about 18 inches. So the leaves on this are, the veins on this are parallel. So they're running parallel to the edges of the leaf. Where a lot of veins, there's a center leaf and then veins coming, a center vein and veins coming off of it. But this has parallel veins in it. This is the wide leaf plantain. And plantain is pronounced and spelled like the banana, but it's obviously not a banana. And then this is the narrow leaf plantain. So it's the same, it just has a narrower leaf. And you can kind of see the flowers in here. So you can eat the leaves, you can eat the flowers. I don't find the leaves tasty at all. They're a great medicinal herb. You can eat them, but medicinally, you can make a poultice. So if you got a bite or a sting or something, you can chew the leaves in your mouth and then stick it right on the bite or the sting. Or if you have a child or a pet that needs treated, you could do the same with them. You chew it and stick it on there. And if you run into poison ivy or stinging nettle, this is a great thing to use to put on that to stop the pain and the itching and the stinging. This is feverfew. Another way to help identify plants besides appearance is scent. So if you get familiar with how a plant smells, feverfew has a pungent smell. I find it unpleasant, but you may not. So it has this kind of ferny leaf. Some people think of chamomile, but chamomile is a finer ferny leaf, and I will show a plant that's related to chamomile coming up. But feverfew looks like this at first. And then later it will have these white flowers, and that's what people think of when they think of chamomile. But the center of this is more flat, where chamomile, it's more of a dome kind of shape. So feverfew can be eaten, but it's mostly thought of as something to help if you have headaches, especially migraines. So you can use it as a tea, you can encapsulate it and take it, and help with your headaches and migraines. This is mallow, and some people ate this as children and called it cheesies or belly buttons. So the whole plant is edible, and it's related to hollyhocks. And if you're familiar with hollyhocks, you might see a similarity in the leaves, but this grows much shorter and smaller. So you can eat the leaves, You can eat the little seed pods, which are the things people call the cheesies. You can eat the flowers, you can eat the root. The root was sometimes used to make marshmallows. There's another plant called marshmallow that's taller and related, and that was more often used to make marshmallows. This is used as a substitute for slippery elm, so it helps coat things. So if you have a sore throat, stomach ache or something like that, it can help coating that to help that feel better. This is bee balm or monarda, and the flowers can be white, red, purplish pink. It has a very unique flower which helps with identification, and bees are attracted to it, butterflies and hummingbirds, and it has kind of a minty flavor and scent, so it can be used in teas and for flavorings. This is mullein, and some people call it lamb's ear, and that's one problem with common names, is because there can be more than one plant called the same thing. So lamb's ear, at least where I live, is not something you would find in the wild, where mullein is, and mullein is considered a weed. They both have soft leaves. Mullein has a kind of greenish yellow leaf, and lamb's ear has more of a grayish green leaf, and lamb's ear has thicker leaves. So mullein, the first year, and they also grow differently, mullein has this rosette shape leaf pattern is what they call it the first year. And then the second year it gets like the one on the right, where it grows tall, and depending on the soil it could be several feet tall or it might be only a foot tall. And then it has yellow flowers, and you can eat the flowers, and I don't think they're tasty, but it's a good idea to try them because you might feel differently. The flowers are also infused in oil to use for headaches. The leaves are something that in the past was smoked to help with asthma. Now you can get encapsulated herbs that have it in to help with lung conditions and asthma. It's also a great toilet paper substitute. So if we're out in the wild somewhere, it's not something nice and soft that you could use. And when the flowers die and it turns all brown, they used to dip it in tallow and use it as a torch. So it's a multi-use plant. And this is the one that's related to chamomile. This is pineapple weed. So some people think that chamomile has kind of an apple scent. Pineapple weed has kind of a pineapple scent. And it looks a lot like chamomile, but there's no little white petals. It just has this little dome-shaped center. And so that looks a little like pineapple too. It's fairly low growing. You can use it just like you would chamomile. So you could eat it, you could dry the flowers and use it for an herb tea. This is purslane. So purslane is the one that you could get mixed up with the flat growing spurge. So the differences are, purslane has a succulent leaf. If you break it, it's clear inside. And if you see flowers, they're tiny yellow flowers. So spurge, the one you don't want to eat, if you break it, it's white sap inside. It has tiny white flowers, and it is not succulent. So again, purslane is succulent, clear sap, tiny yellow flowers. They both grow really flat. Purslane has kind of a lemony scent or lemony flavor to some people. I've mostly have eaten it in salads, but you can pickle it, you can put it into soups. In some cultures of the world, they eat this regularly, where a lot of the time in the US it's just considered a weed, but it's really good for you. It's high in omega-3 fatty acids. Sometimes it grows in sidewalks and driveways. I would not harvest it from there. But if it grows somewhere else in your yard, as long as it hasn't been treated with pesticides, go ahead and try it and see what you think. This is shepherd's purse, and shepherd's purse in my area tends to come up in the spring and then be gone when it starts getting hotter. So on the left here, you can kind of see tiny white flowers, and then the seed pods have a heart or a purse shape. And so it'll just have a really skinny stalk, little tiny white flowers at the top, and then as the flowers start to fade, these little purse-shaped seed pods. And then at the base, sometimes the flowers or sometimes the leaves are somewhat large, but most of the time I see it, they're pretty small. I actually have some right here that I just pulled up today, and this one has pretty small leaves with it. So maybe you can even see that better than in the picture. but the leaves sometimes to me look like a dandelion. So you can eat this whole thing, and I think the flowers taste a little bit like broccoli. And this is also something that helps stop bleeding. So if you're having trouble and you need to stop some bleeding internally or externally, you can use it. If it's internally, you can eat it. If it's externally, you can just put it on it. You may have heard about cayenne stopping bleeding. So shepherd's purse does the same kind of thing, but you're not going to find cayenne in the wild, at least not in my area. So shepherd's purse would be something you can use instead. This is yarrow, and yarrow is the one that sometimes people get confused with poison hemlock, and I'll talk about some differences, but yarrow has many medicinal purposes. You can eat it too. I don't find it tasty, but it could be a great seasoning in with other things. And yarrow leaves, this one's kind of wilted, but they're ferny, but it's a very narrow ferny leaf, where with poison hemlock, it is more like carrots or dill. And then with the flowers, this is a yarrow flower, and it looks pretty much like it does right there, except it's turned brown. So there's not a lot of difference once the flower fades. And this is not poison hemlock. I'm not touching poison hemlock, but it is parsley, one of its relatives. So the flower is much like it. So as the flower starts to fade, the seeds fall off, and you end up with this sort of upside down umbrella kind of look to it. So the flowers are much different also. So make sure you know the difference between those two. And again, if anything looks like parsley, carrots, dill, don't touch it unless you have proper ID. And yarrow tends to like sunny, drier soils. Poison hemlock tends to like damp or shadier areas, but there's exceptions, certainly. So on the left here is yarrow, and on the right is poison hemlock. And so you can see them side by side, and you can see the difference between the ferny leaves of the poison hemlock and the ferny leaves of the yarrow. This just happens to be a place that for some reason they're growing right together. Be sure, again, that you have correct ID before consuming, using, or even touching any plant. And then for more information, follow the links below this for social media and other sources to give you more information. And I've created these wild herb card decks that have these plants and some others in them, where it has a picture on the front. On the back, it has a verbal description and edible and medicinal use. These are printed on plastic, so they're waterproof and tear resistant. I have 2 decks right now. I'm working on a 3rd. And thank you so much. Again, be careful, but get to know these plants, and thank you so much for joining me today.